All right. Well, hope you all have enjoyed the first day of hardwear.io. It's been fun to be back in an in-person conference. So I'm Trammell Hudson with Lower Layer Labs, and I am not an expert in hardware or security, but I pretend to be, and I really enjoy thinking about secure things and how to build things that are open and good for the user. And with me today is Fredrik Stromberg from Mulvad VPN, and we're going to be talking about can we build secure open hardware roots of trust? So before we try to get a yes or no answer to that, I think we have to ask sort of a bigger question, which is when we say secure, we always have to ask under what threat model? What are the attackers going after? What are we trying to protect? We also have to ask, what do we mean by open? Is it open if it's using some proprietary ASIC cell library? Is it open if it has some hardware blobs? Is it open if the data sheet for the microcontroller is NDA'd? We also have to ask questions about what do we mean by hardware? ASIC is a type of hardware. FPGAs are types of hardware. If we're doing a microcontroller with some secure element, or are we trying to build something with an x86 and a TPM? We also need to think about what do we mean by build? Is this something where we're writing code? Is this something where we are writing Verilog? Is this something where we're designing PCBs? Are we fabbing chips? And how do we verify the results of it? I guess we also need to ask, who's we? Is it the hobbyist community? Is it security researchers? Is it Intel? Is it TSMC? We should probably think about, can, for what cost? Did we stop to think if we should? And since we're questioning everything up there, we should also ask, what is a root of trust anyway? And why should we care? And so I'd love to ask Fredrik that question. What is a root of trust and why do you care?
What is trust and why do I care? Was that the question?
Or what is the root of trust?
Oh, what is the root of trust? For starters, what is trust? I think that trust implies some type of vulnerability. There's an expectation that a system or an organization or a piece of software, you are exposing yourself to that entity and relying on it to act in your interests going forward. And so, and that connects to like trustworthiness. How is something worthy of my trust? And what is the nature of the vulnerability I'm exposing? Is it my personal information? Is it the security of a door? Is it, And root of trust is sort of this axiom or root of the tree of things that we need to trust. And by having a very trustworthy trust anchor, we can then build upon that and sort of expand the TCB in more trustworthy ways. That's how I think about it.
So if we want to bring that back to practicality, why is it important that we have roots of trust, and why is it important that they be open?
Well, I think that privacy relies on the trustworthiness of our digital systems, and trust is facilitated by security. So to some extent, I think that security systems, security technologies exist to facilitate trust. So reproducible builds, for instance, is a wonderful concept that allows us to sort of distrust in the sense of requiring less trust in the build system, because we can have multiple build systems, and as long as they all come to the same conclusion regarding the checksum of the artifact we just built, even if an individual system has been compromised, they are less, they're more trustworthy in a sense, but we are less exposed to them because a compromise can be more easily discovered. And I think there are tons of these technologies, and especially to make it a little more philosophical, perhaps, especially as computers are becoming extensions of our minds. How can we use security to facilitate trust, and how can we entities that are very powerful, how can we increase the transparency and accountability of those systems, and perhaps distribute the power or decrease our exposure to those systems. That sounds nice to me.
So I know Molvad has been sponsoring quite a few firmware projects around building open firmware for servers, and as a way to try to bring trustability and accountability for the services that you all run. And do you think that is that having that sort of transparency is going to be more important? Is that going to require openness, or do you think that this is going to be something feasible to do with closed systems?
I think that there is a tension to some. I mean, first of all, I would love for all infrastructure to be transparent. I would love to be able to reduce the state of a system or the cryptographic identity and the authentication of a system to some checksum that represents, not the hardware, obviously, because that's, of course you can take the RTL and you can hash it and if you run it on an FPGA, but ultimately there's an ASIC somewhere, and you don't know anything about the doping or the electrocrystal migration stuff, but if we just look at the software, you can reduce the entire state of the system and the possible state transitions of that system to some kind of statement. And I think that's something we should aspire to do.
Bunny had a wonderful quote in his talk about building open source secure hardware that you can't hash hardware, which is really unfortunate. That it's really hard to know what are we running. And this gets to the question about when we build something, how do we know that it's what we think it is? That you mentioned reproducible builds as a important part of our software supply chain. But in terms of the hardware, it seems that it really seems to me that if we don't have that openness, we're not going to be able to know how much we can trust it. So where we get a certificate from a vendor that says that they have signed this cert, that tells us really nothing about the state of the hardware that's underneath it. And I'm also really curious about your views on where we draw the line on what is hardware. In terms of the ASIC to FPGA to PCB to server running open firmware. Where do you think the hardware line is?
Trick question. I don't know, but I think that we can certainly. To some extent, let's say that there's a piece of hardware, there's some SOC you have to trust, and maybe you don't really know or can't look at what the logic gates actually implement, but at least if the specification is open, you can reason about its security properties, which is definitely better than not being able to do that. And I think that getting away from the idea that, or fully embracing the idea that our SOCs and the main boards are already distributed systems of computers, and just saying, okay, great, how can we do this better? Well, for starters, maybe we shouldn't do any private key SSL stuff calculations in the x86 core. Maybe we should do that in a separate core and then just have a signing oracle. So at least if the attacker gains root, they can't get the private key. They can only do infinite signing operations, which is slightly better. Maybe we should put an audit log in there too, so we have an audit log of all the signing operations that have been done. And when it comes to the specs of the ASIC, Of course, there are different things you can choose to trust and not trust. Like if you say, oh, we're going to use a PUF, a physically unclonable function, to use that for the key derivation for some cryptographic identity and authentication of a particular chip. Yeah, then you have to rely on the impurities or the entropy effects in the foundry. Whereas if you instead say, okay, we're not going to use a PUF that relies on analog weird stuff in the process, we're going to use ring oscillators and just have fuses that are triggered the first time we turn the chip on. So I think that's one example of how you can trust less.
I really like that example of the computers being distributed systems. And that was a point that I made when I was complaining about BMC security, that where we have all of these sort of interconnected pieces that are talking and perhaps foolishly trusting each other. There's been proposals like the DICE key derivation system as a form of hierarchical roots of trust. Or hierarchical trees of trust, where each device attests to the devices that it's connected to and all the way up the chain, and then you can form a compound sort of attestation about the state of the entire system. And it seems like that's a really good way of capturing not just has the what's in the system, but also has anything changed in the system. DICE does a really cool thing where it computes a key based on the firmware in the device, so any malicious changes should change that attestation. Do you think that is something that we're going to see in commodity systems anytime soon?
I sure hope so. I mean, my opinions on, we have the same opinions on measured versus verified boot and where it's needed and so on. But I think that is a core idea that I think is really great if your SOC or if your die has a boot ROM in it, and the boot ROM does the measured boot thing where it says, okay, I'm now going to load some firmware from a SPI flash. I load it into memory, hash it, ideally commit that hash to some separate hardware domain that is only reset on hard reset of the platform, and then you sort of extend the state from there. So if you a TPM is completely detached from the boot chain. You're relying on the firmware to actually talk to the TPM. But if you have that measurement, if you have the measured boot, it's more unconditional if it's in the die boot ROM. That certainly make things better. And as you said, like DICE, I think that's a great example where you have some unique per chip secret. And you take the hash of the first stage of the whatever software you're executing, and that in turn can then hash the next state and so on. And at every stage you use the first stage you use the per chip unique secret and the hash of the first stage of the firmware in a key derivation function to derive the cryptographic identity or private key for authentication. I think that's totally the right approach.
It seems like a really good balance between the user freedom of being able to update the firmware while also preserving the ability to protect secrets. And the really nice thing about that is the size of the secret that you have to protect is that small on-die piece. So it becomes more feasible to sort of actually design it into the system in some way, either with a PUF, which seems like a promising capability, although I'm not sure where the patents are right now, as well as some of the research on them. But a lot of it also starts to run into the threat model, where if you have fuses and your adversary has a electron microscope, that's not wonderful.
Unless you use electrocrystal migration.
Right. Yeah, some of the phase change sort of things definitely can help. The other place where the threat model starts to come into, where this sort of segues into, is what does physical access mean? That where if the threat model includes an adversary who has hands on the device, it seems there's a lot of different scales. Just here today we've had folks carving the tops off the Titan chips to put a probe on them, which is a really cool attack. But as they pointed out, it's a little beyond sort of the ordinary threat model. Are you optimistic that we can protect against lesser attacks than that?
Lesser attacks than which one?
Than decapping and listening for side channels?
Yeah, I think so. But I mean, that's not my field of expertise, but I definitely see a tension between the openness and or how open source something is and physical security. Because if you I mean, on the one extreme, it's okay, say you want to make an ASIC that has both passive and active tamper detection measures and does serialization of some key memory based on a sensor triggering. At that point, you definitely don't want to tell the attacker, oh, over here on the die is where the sensors are, so make sure your probes are between them. But if we're going for that kind of design, then yeah, we're not going to be able to reason about it as much, which is unfortunate. So obviously, I mean, I love I think there's a lot. To me, trustworthiness is facilitated a lot by understandability and being able to reason about the design. And if the design is not open, then you can't. And maybe the fact that it has an open system has a weaker threat model for physical threats. Maybe we should accept that and say, well, the security system should consist of a bunch of devices. And if any single device is compromised, it doesn't matter. Similar to reproducible builds. In the reproducible build scenario, we can detect and mitigate a single build system being compromised doesn't matter, which is nice.
Your mention of active countermeasures reminds me of the IBM white paper on their crypto cards, where they have a battery in the card that's then surrounded by all sorts of shielding and temperature sensors and motion sensors. And basically, if you look at it wrong, it will zeroize the keys and erase itself, which is perhaps good for the security, but is absolutely detrimental to sort of the user modifiability. I have a lot of trouble seeing good ways to build systems that have that level of security while also keeping them open. And unless, much like Bunny's precursor, it's something where the end user builds it and seals it themselves. In that sort of case, that shifts a lot of responsibility onto the end user. And I wonder if that's an inescapable part of openness.
I mean, there are. I think the potential to improve the trustworthiness of our systems is immense. There are tons of opportunities, and some of them are unrelated to hardware. Like maybe, let's say you have a device. I don't know. You have a GPG signing key or something for software releases, and you say, well, we really, really need to protect this private key. And then you say, well, are you actually interested in detecting usage of the key? Are you actually interested in having a tamper-evident, verifiable audit log of all the signatures? Because maybe your attackers won't attack you if they know that it's going to be discovered immediately. And that is another reason why I really like transparency logs, because that's a way to get transparency around, for instance, what are the SSL certificates that have been created from a particular CA, and we can use that in software releases as well, of course.
So in that case, it's about shortening the time from compromise to detection.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that there was the point brought up in the Titan talk this morning that the FIDO counters could be used to detect an adversary that has cloned a chip. It might give them one chance to use it, but it would at least let you know that something has gone wrong. It's also, I think, interesting how many of the talks here have not necessarily been hardware failures. That the Titan one with EM is hardware, but the AirTag one was glitching software running in the system. The medical pump one was a JSON parsing error. Are we focusing too much thought on hardware-based threat models when our software house is in such disarray or built out of such straw?
I don't know. It depends on your threat model. But
that is the evergreen answer for every question.
I mean, I don't know. I think we definitely need a multifaceted approach. I think that if we look at creativity as a abstract concept, it's really just combining two or more existing things in new ways. And I think if we, I certainly, my eyes were I got immense insight from reading just books like Code by Petzold, and then Computer Organization and Design by Patterson and Hennessy, and realizing, wow, this is how hardware works. And then just sort of doing away with the idea that, we need to execute all the hardware on this general purpose thing over here. And then what if we just tear this idea apart and then put things over here, and then you can just play with how you use the different cryptographic primitives or constructions, and you gain new and interesting security properties. And of course, I think that a physical attack is way less likely than a purely digital attacker. I would say in general, we definitely focus mostly on the purely digital attacker.
Yeah, I joke that I don't actually know what people do with computers because I basically just look at boot time security, so I'm always rebooting them and digging through firmware. So my view as a sort of security cosplayer is, very, very focused on sort of the low-level attacks and things. And my personal opinion is that as a community, we can build the best systems that we can, and then hope that the people who build the operating systems and the applications on it do a good job of taking that root of trust that we've provided and be able to carry the chain of trust forward. Though at some point, we do have to recognize it's out of our hands.
Yeah, the wonderful thing about computers is that they do exactly what we tell them to do. Unfortunately, our ability to accurately describe our intentions is an entirely different matter. And another wonderful thing is that modern programming languages, they help us protect memory, and compilers like the Rust compiler helps us detect all kinds of errors before we commit them to production. So, on some level, it's about managing complexity, and I think things are definitely improving.
And the fun thing with if we decide that FPGAs are hardware, that it gives us the flexibility to move things, from one level to the other. Occasionally, it does feel that writing Verilog, we're still somewhat in the dark ages, especially compared to like the Rust compiler that is making sure that we don't do dangerous things and helping and giving us good error messages. But yeah, that sort of flexibility to move things around seems like we can improve the security properties on these systems. And again, my view on the openness is that with the open system, we can choose where we put those resources and where we put those capabilities. And have you considered trying to do anything on the do-it-yourself ASIC side of things?
Sorry, what was the question?
The moving beyond the FPGAs and actually putting it into ASICs.
I don't. I mean, the problem. What I love about the idea of open source tool chains for FPGAs is that, well, then as Bunny says, like or in his talk about that the what are they going to attack? It's much harder if you have a small series ASIC. That can be attacked in all kinds of ways. Whereas if you rely on an ICE40 or an ECP5 from Lattice, or you rely on something from Xilinx, and then, as you said, you move the hardware around, and was it Bunny who called it hardware ASLR? Basically, it's not clear to me what the attacker, how the attacker is going to attack it. I mean, of course, if it's an attacker that's physically present, maybe they've compromised the foundry process or some part of the design and say, oh, I can dump your bit stream if I use these pins. Okay, but if the attacker is purely digital and there's let's say a TRNG in there or some signing operation, how does the logic has to be really complex to say, oh, this is clearly a TRNG over here and I'm going to influence this somehow. So I think that's nice.
Yeah, I really love that quote about, the FPGAs are the ASLR for hardware, because it really does. When he gave the talk at CCC, I was initially skeptical that FPGAs could be better for security than ASICs. Although after thinking about it for some time, I'm coming around to his view.
Yeah, I mean it's sort of apples and oranges a little bit, because the physical attacker model is weaker as compared to, let's say, active tamper detection measures in an ASIC, but it's different. And if you can architect your system in a way to get around those weaker parts, then I think that's definitely what I would prefer. Then again, I really like open source.
So what else? What other topics have we not covered? Yeah, let's
sure.
do that.
Does anyone have questions they would like to have the panelists discuss?
I don't understand the FPGAs at all. So I maybe have a very simple question. Isn't it possible to have active tamper measures in FPGAs as well?
One of Bunny's arguments is that the structure of FPGAs makes them a lot harder to decap successfully, because and he had a bunch of photos in his presentation showing sort of that when they talk about fabric for the interconnect, it's very stringy, and decapping it does lead to weirdness. The other difference is that all of the runtime state is stored in SRAM. So in order to so you can't just take photos of the die and deduce what's happening. You have to actively measure what is in those cells. and if you, while you're decapping, if you short the fabric, you potentially can disrupt the power supply to them. Do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, maybe say that ultimately an FPGA is also, it's a very heterogeneous chip. You have the Zinc, for instance, which is there's an ARM hardcore, and then there's FPGA fabric. But then the FPGA fabric itself consists of logic cells and cells that are dedicated for memory, and maybe you have some hard blocks for acceleration of various things. And of course, some of those you have to look at the specific chip to say, well, I'm not sure, but I would assume some of the more expensive ones from Xilinx perhaps contains active tamper detection. But then again, that's not in the FPGA substrate. But of course, you could have a sensor connected to a pin, which is connected to your FPGA logic. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, hi. I was thinking, what are your thoughts on certification of open source hardware? So something like a device like this, I think it would be nice to have something like this certified.
Well, I think the Open Source Hardware Foundation, for instance, there are some certifications, I think, that are like making some type of stamp of approval on the open source hardwareness of a given product. When it comes to certification of the security properties, I don't know. I think if you look at security protocols like network protocols like WireGuard or other network protocols, I think the really good ones, they have well-defined state machines, and the cryptographic primitives or cryptographic constructions are intertwined in such a way that it makes it really easy to reason about the state changes. You can say, oh, this is like it's 4,000 lines of code versus, let's say, 500,000 lines of code. Here's the flow of how the things are, like the key derivation function and the cryptographic checksum, how they are interlinked, and I think the same goes for hardware. If we have a hardware design where, for instance, the measurement of the firmware that is loaded after hard reset, if that measurement is unconditional because it's in the die, that is a way better situation than if we have to, trust that measurement happens in the firmware that happens to be on a SPI flash.
The other issue that you start to run into with things like the FIPS certification is A, it costs money, which a lot of open hardware doesn't have, and B, you can end up having to maintain bugs in order to maintain compliance. That most TPM have a FIPS mode that everyone says do not use because it has insecure padding and some other problems. But that was the mode that it was certified in. And I think as you move up to the higher FIPS levels that do take into account tamper resistance and active tamper countermeasures, there's just not a lot of products at all that are implementing those. IBM sells crypto accelerators and line cards that have it, and they are as big as a GPU and contain a small PowerPC sort of processor, surrounded by meshes and batteries and things. I'm not sure if any of the if there's a huge push yet for that sort of commercial certification of open hardware. But there's nothing that says as a community we couldn't come up with our own sets of standards. There's no reason we necessarily have to implement FIPS and the TCG specs, especially if there are things that are better suited for the operating systems and the applications that we want to run on top of them.
I have a comment as well. So I get that large organizations really want certifications or some way of saying, okay, we can buy this, but we can't buy that. But if you don't care about that, and you simply look at state of the art across the board of security technologies, I think that it's developing so rapidly that we should just iterate on them and make better and better things. One example from the 90s and early 2000s is the discussion around, should we encrypt and then MAC, or should we MAC and then encrypt? And I think that discussion has now been settled, but there are still protocols that do the wrong thing. And the same goes with these trust anchors, or the roots of trust, and how do we do measured boot. And I understand that ASIC designers and Intel has definitely been saved a bunch of times by the flexibility of their microcode. But at the same time, of course, that means more complexity and potential for vulnerabilities. But if we can, I think that we're approaching a time where we can say, okay, this is a good way to boot a system from hard reset and upwards, and ASIC designers will start to introduce stuff like more unconditional measured boot eventually. I hope so, at least. It doesn't seem that hard. Famous last words.
Hello, thanks for the informative talk. So I just have a quick question about the randomization TRNG. Sometimes there is an ICs like standalone TRNG and some microcontrollers that have the capability of the TRNG. So if you would to choose which one I can rely on, which one I can trust, the standalone ICs, or just how good is the microcontroller capabilities TRNGs?
I think in unison we should say it depends on your threat model.
Okay.
The one issue I've seen with a lot of the microcontroller, the security aspects of different microcontrollers is a lot of times the data sheets are NDA'd, so you may not be able to find out all of the information you want to know about it. But in terms of the threat model, having anything external means that you now have an external bus that you're talking to. So if you have physical security or supply chain security concerns, that's a bus that an attacker can potentially be feeding malicious data into your system. Having more stuff on die or in the package raises the difficulty of that attack. Although, again, as we saw from earlier today, it doesn't eliminate the attack, but it does make it a lot more challenging.
Okay, I think we pretty much run out of time. That was a really great panel, a really interesting, getting my mind spinning. So thank you for that.